Sometimes, things happen in such unexpected ways that they become almost impossible to believe. When she found herself alone at home, she never imagined that a simple moment of peace would be enough to turn her life upside down. The presence of her husband's son, who until then seemed like just another figure in a routine, transformed into something much more unsettling. What should have been an ordinary afternoon became the starting point for a story of betrayal that defies all logic. The most unbelievable part? The fact that it all happened right under her nose, without her even realizing what was about to unfold. But as we know, destiny always finds a way to make the truth come to light, even when you try to ignore it. The pain of discovery is indescribable, and the protagonist had to deal with this reality in a brutal and unexpected way. The shock of realizing that her husband's son was involved in an unthinkable betrayal not only shattered the trust she had in her family, but also made her question what loyalty truly meant. After all, when what you fear most becomes your reality, what is left? It's easy to judge others, but the truth is that we are all susceptible to complicated choices and moments of weakness. What did she do next? Well, that's another part of the story you'll need to hear until the end. Now, if you're shocked by this story and want to understand more about the emotions involved in situations of betrayal and infidelity, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications to follow more stories like this, as well as insights and powerful tips that can change your life. Don't miss the chance to learn and delve deeper into this world. Subscribe now and keep following the content we have for you. In a marriage, loneliness can creep in silently, almost like a shadow that grows every day. The narrator knew this, but she didn't want to admit it. Her husband, Richard, was always absent, caught up in endless business trips. She began to feel the weight of his absence, not just in the house, but also in her soul. When Jake, her stepson, came home for the summer holidays, a strange discomfort began to take hold of her. Those prolonged glances, those almost imperceptible smiles, made something stir inside her in a way she didn't know how to control. It was a dangerous tension, growing with each passing day. What once seemed like merely an innocent behavior from Jake started to reveal something deeper, something more dangerous. She didn't want to realize it, but the subtle flirting began to become impossible to ignore. He knew exactly how to touch her, how to make her feel special, like she was the only woman in the world. She found herself lost, unsure whether to pull away or give in to the temptation. The attraction that once seemed like just a spark was turning into a fire she didn't know how to extinguish. And the worst part? The more she tried to resist, the stronger the connection between them became, creating a magnetic field of forbidden desires and emotional confusion. Every glance, every gesture was a silent promise, a veiled provocation that fed a growing desire inside her. The emptiness she felt with Richard, though she never admitted it, was unexpectedly filled by Jake. She found herself torn, lost in a sea of conflicting feelings. The guilt, the loyalty to Richard, and the attraction to Jake created a whirlwind inside her that seemed impossible to control. And yet, she didn't know how to stop. Every step she took toward Jake felt like a more imminent risk, a deeper betrayal, and the worst part was that she couldn't pull away anymore. The line between right and wrong began to dissolve for the narrator. Jake's touch, which once might have been interpreted as innocent, now became something more charged, more intense. He touched her arm in a way that seemed much more than just a simple gesture of proximity. She felt the heat of his hand, the soft pressure that made her shiver inside. It was an unexpected sensation, something she never imagined feeling, especially from someone so close to her, but the attraction was undeniable. Even with her mind screaming at her to pull away, her body seemed not to listen. With each passing day, the distance between her and Jake grew smaller. He moved closer, with subtle touches, lingering looks, and words that seemed to have a double meaning. The narrator knew what was happening, but she refused to acknowledge those feelings. She tried to ignore the growing attraction, trying to convince herself that it was all just an illusion, but the truth was clear. She could no longer see Jake as just her stepson. Something more was happening there, something dangerous that she no longer knew how to control. She tried to seek refuge in thoughts of Richard, her husband, who was distant, absent in his commitments. But the more he was absent, the more Jake became an overwhelming presence. The feeling of being torn between Richard's love and the irresistible attraction to Jake seemed like an impossible dilemma to resolve. Every time their eyes met, a part of her wanted to pull away, but the other, weaker part, yielded to the magnetism of that look. And even knowing that the line between loyalty and betrayal was fading, she didn't know how to turn back. The kitchen, usually a space of routine, became, that night, a silent stage for a growing and uncontrollable attraction. Jake approached her as she prepared something simple, but at that moment, everything seemed to transform. He stood there, close enough that the heat of his body was almost palpable. She felt her heart race, the tension between them becoming so thick that it was almost tangible. The look they exchanged said more than words could express. It was a silent invitation, an acknowledgement that what was happening between them was more than just physical. It was a deep, forbidden connection. But no matter how much she tried to fight it, she couldn't deny the truth that was right in front of her eyes. The attraction was mutual, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. She felt a mix of desire and guilt consuming her. Jake's touch, the words left unsaid, the shared smiles, all of it began to turn into something more dangerous, something that, deep down, she knew she could never forgive herself for. With each passing second, the line between right and wrong blurred a little more, and she no longer knew where she stood. She was surrendering to something she knew was wrong, but somehow felt necessary. It was then that, suddenly, the kitchen door slammed open. The neighbor, who had decided to show up without warning, interrupted the tense and crucial moment. The narrative of the scene changed instantly, but the impact of the interruption was not what the narrator expected. The emptiness of the interruption left her even more disturbed, as if the universe had thrown a brutal reality in her face. What could have been an irreversible action was barely stopped, but the feeling that something had already changed between her and Jake was undeniable. What would happen next now seemed like just a matter of time. The silence in the isolated place seemed to amplify everything that was happening in the narrator's mind. The trip, which should have been an escape from routine, ended up becoming the perfect setting for internal confrontations she had feared for weeks. Jake, with his increasingly dominant presence, could no longer be ignored, and neither could she. The desire floating between them was no longer something simple, but an uncontrollable force, a reality that could no longer be suppressed. He confronted her directly, the tension in the air palpable. "You feel this too, don't you?" he asked, with a gaze so penetrating it seemed to disarm her. She tried to resist. She tried to deny, to push away the idea that something more was happening between her and Jake. But inside, she knew it was impossible to lie to herself. The words he said made the doubt dissipate definitively. She felt the intensity of the connection between them, a mixture of desire and conflict that left her speechless. She wanted to scream, say she was wrong, that it was all just an illusion, but she couldn't. The truth was right there, raw and exposed, and Jake knew it. He understood her in a way no one else could, and that both terrified and attracted her, all at once. As she tried to pull away, the narrator asked to leave, as if she could still escape the emotional storm consuming her. But the feeling that it was too late was already embedded in her mind. What once seemed like a choice was now a condemnation. She found herself lost in a labyrinth of guilt and desire, not knowing how to get out. She wanted to go back, but at the same time, she knew she couldn't anymore. The worst had already happened, and nothing could fix the distance that had grown between her and the life she once knew. Morning arrived, but the weight of the previous night's decisions still hung over her. Trying to act normal next to Jake was like trying to catch a strong wind in her hands. Every word spoken seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Every exchanged glance felt like a reminder that something had changed irreversibly. She forced herself to behave as if nothing was happening, but inside, she felt the tension between them growing with every second. What should have been an ordinary day was now marked by an increasing internal conflict. Her loyalty to Richard, her husband, was slowly unraveling, like a dry leaf blown by the wind. Jake's presence by her side, more intense than ever, made her mind split. She knew what she should do. She knew what morality told her to do. But the desire for Jake was something she no longer knew how to control. Every gesture from him, every word, made her body react in a way she could no longer understand. She was torn, feeling her life being pulled in two very different directions, and neither one seemed right. When Richard finally returned home, something changed in the air. The familiarity of his presence couldn't suppress the growing tension between her and Jake. The simple fact that Richard was there seemed more like a reminder of what she was about to lose than a comfort. She tried to focus on her husband, on his words and gestures, but her mind couldn't stop drifting to thoughts of Jake. The attraction, which she had tried to ignore, was now becoming a heavy burden in her heart. She knew she was drifting away from everything she knew, but at the same time, she couldn't resist anymore. The atmosphere in the house felt heavy, as if the air was thick with something she could no longer ignore. The sense of inadequacy she felt toward her marriage with Richard had never been so evident. As he spent his days away or lost in his own world, she found herself growing further from him. The love that once seemed unshakable was now weakening, and deep down, she knew something was missing. The connection she longed for seemed to fade, and a sense of loneliness enveloped her more each day. The marriage was no longer what she had imagined, and the signs of it were everywhere, even in the little things she tried to ignore. It was then that, hearing footsteps in the hallway, a wave of discomfort washed over her completely. She immediately recognized Jake's presence, and her heart raced in a way she could no longer control. He was there, outside the room, as if waiting for something, waiting for her. The tension heightened, her body automatically reacting to his proximity, but at the same time, she knew this couldn't happen. She tried to rationalize, trying to ignore the magnetism between them, but the connection was undeniable. He was there, once again, pushing the limits and testing her resistance. The sound of Jake's footsteps seemed to amplify the distance between what she wanted and what she knew was right. She could no longer deny what was happening inside her. With every passing moment, it became harder to resist. Her mind was torn between the desire to pull away and the need to be close to him. What had started as a simple attraction was now becoming something much greater, something she no longer knew how to control. And there, in that silent hallway, with Jake's presence hanging in the air, she felt herself approaching a point of no return. The next morning, everything seemed normal at first glance. Richard, as always, was lost in his own concerns, unaware of what was really happening inside the house. He didn't notice the tension hanging in the air, didn't see how Jake's presence had changed everything between them. Jake, in turn, acted casually, as if nothing had happened, but the narrator knew the reality was quite different. The game of appearances between them was complicated and unsettling. She tried to act normally, to smile as she always did, but every gesture, every glance, seemed to carry an extra weight, a subtext only she and Jake understood. The conflict within her grew with each passing second. On one hand, there was guilt, weighing down on her shoulders like a burden she didn't know how to carry. She tried to convince herself she was doing the right thing, that her marriage still had value, but the desire for Jake was undeniable and intensified every day. She found herself torn between two powerful forces: loyalty to Richard, her husband, and the attraction she felt for Jake, which seemed to grow uncontrollably. This game between guilt and desire became more complex with every interaction. And as Jake stayed close, she felt like she was on the verge of a decision that could change her life forever. While Richard continued to live in his bubble, unaware of anything going on, the narrator knew she was drifting away from him, little by little. What had once seemed safe and predictable was now being threatened by the intensity of her conflicting emotions. She didn't know how far this could go, nor if she even wanted to know. What remained clear was that, sooner or later, she would have to make a choice. And, in that moment, she was caught between the guilt consuming her and the desire she could no longer ignore. Dinner that night seemed like any other, but to the narrator, the atmosphere was different. Every bite felt heavier, every word exchanged more laden with meaning. Richard was absorbed in a conversation with Jake, both apparently unconcerned, but she couldn't focus on anything they were saying. Jake's presence was inescapable. His eyes, increasingly intense, seemed physically heavy on her. Every glance exchanged felt like a silent confession, and it unsettled her. She no longer knew where to hide, as the awareness of her attraction to him was in every corner of the room, making the environment oppressive. She tried to control herself, but the tension grew with each passing second. The feeling of being torn increased, and she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, even when no one else seemed to notice. She abruptly stood up, a desperate need to escape the suffocating atmosphere taking over her body. She walked outside, seeking some fresh air, trying to clear her mind. But the feeling that there was no turning back haunted her. She knew she was crossing boundaries, but she couldn't pull back anymore. The simple act of stepping outside to breathe seemed like an attempt to escape something much bigger. Jake followed her without her realizing, and the moment he appeared in front of her, the air around her seemed to condense. He confronted her directly, without hesitation. There were no more games. He knew exactly what was happening between them, and the weight of his words hit her like a blow. The tension between them had reached a point of no return, and she had no more answers. She was face to face with what she had been avoiding, and her internal struggle between desire and guilt had become unbearable. He was there, in front of her, daring her to face the truth she had been trying to hide. When Richard left for another business trip, the house fell silent, and the air felt heavier than ever. It was as if the world around her had stopped, leaving the narrator alone with her conflicting feelings. She knew what was happening inside her, but trying to understand it seemed pointless. Guilt tormented her, but at the same time, the desire for Jake had become unbearable. He was in her mind every second, and the more she tried to push him away, the closer he seemed to get. He was a constant presence, and the moment he appeared at her door, she knew it was too late to resist. With a single exchange of glances, everything she had tried to avoid unraveled. Jake entered the room without hesitation, as if he already knew this was the decisive moment. The tension in the air was unbearable, but something inside her gave way, and what had started as a simple touch transformed into something much deeper and uncontrollable. They were consumed by passion and guilt. No matter how hard it tried to assert itself, seemed to be swallowed by the intensity of what they were experiencing. The narrator knew it was wrong, that she was betraying Richard in a way she could no longer justify. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. The encounter was overwhelming, a whirlwind of emotions and desire, and when reality finally caught up with her, she was consumed by guilt. After the storm passed, emptiness took over. What she had done couldn't be undone, and no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, there was no justification for her betrayal. She felt like she had lost herself in something she could no longer control, and the weight of her actions crushed her. Now, with Richard away and Jake leaving her to face the consequences alone, she felt more distant than ever from everything she once believed was right. The morning arrived with an unsettling calm. The house, which once seemed full of life, was now immersed in a heavy silence. Richard had returned early from his trip, and the protagonist found herself faced with an inescapable reality. She heard him enter, but for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Her eyes, still heavy with the previous night, searched for a way to hide what was evident. But the weight of her betrayal was unbearable, and she knew there was no way to pretend nothing had happened. Every step Richard took seemed to echo in her mind. Each sound of his clothes or shoes in the hallway made her more nervous. Richard, as if sensing the change in the air, entered quietly, with a distant look in his eyes. He noticed, without the need for words, that something was different. The tension was palpable, but contrary to what she imagined, he didn't confront her immediately. His reaction was more silent, more painful. He didn't question, didn't ask. He simply turned and left, as if absorbing everything at once, as if he was facing something he never imagined would be found in his home. And this, in some way, hurt more than any shout or accusation. The silence between them was more cruel than any other form of confrontation. She stood there, alone with the guilt. The absence of words seemed like the worst punishment of all. Richard had left without a word, but the pain he had left in his place was overwhelming. She knew that, at that moment, there was no turning back. Her betrayal was marked, and she would have to live with it. The weight of the decision she had made the night before, the surrender to temptation, was now revealed in the form of an insurmountable distance. She looked at the door through which he had left, feeling the impact of her action. And, in that instant, all that remained was the vast emptiness left by the betrayal, and a guilt that seemed to consume her soul. The following morning arrived, but peace seemed out of reach. The narrator woke up with a sense of emptiness, as if the world had unraveled during the night. She tried to act normally, pretend that nothing had changed, but the tension between her and Jake was undeniable. Their glances, once discreet, were now loaded with meanings she no longer knew how to hide. Jake's behavior had become bolder, more evident, and she was increasingly aware of what was developing between them. But what consumed her the most was the emotional whirlwind that dominated her. She knew she was drifting away from what could have been, but at the same time, she couldn't escape her desire for him. When Richard came home, she felt a wave of discomfort, as if his presence made everything harder. His familiarity made her feel guilty, but also distant from everything she felt for Jake. Her husband seemed unaware, too caught up in his own thoughts, but the narrator felt as if he was a shadow, a constant reminder of her loyalty, which was now becoming a burden. The attempt to be normal beside Richard felt like a farce, a performance. Her mind and heart were elsewhere, with Jake. She tried to force herself to focus on the present, but the memories of the previous night, the growing attraction to Jake, pulled her toward a future she didn't want to face. More and more, the line between loyalty and desire was becoming blurred, and she was lost in the midst of it all. What was right? What was wrong? Her guilt consumed her, but the temptation of Jake, of something forbidden, seemed to call her every second. She knew she had to make a decision, but she felt like she was being swallowed by the situation. Richard's presence made her tense, but Jake's closeness made her heart race. Between what was expected of her as a wife and what her body was asking for, the confusion only grew. She was torn, unable to choose between the security of her old life and the temptation that had now become irresistible. The feeling of inadequacy seemed to grow every day, a constant presence in the protagonist's marriage. She felt as though she was failing somehow, as if something had been lost, but she didn't know what exactly. Richard, although physically present, seemed emotionally distant. He was busy, or maybe the gap between them was larger than she had imagined. The love that once felt solid and unbreakable now felt fragile. She didn't know if the guilt was all hers or if Richard was also letting the relationship cool. Either way, the emptiness in the marriage was growing, and she felt she could no longer ignore it. Then, on a quiet night, she heard footsteps outside the bedroom. At first, she thought it was just the sound of the house, but soon she realized it wasn't. The footsteps were closer, heavier. She recognized Jake's presence. Her heart raced knowing he was so close. The tension in the air was palpable, as if at any moment the line between right and wrong would disappear completely. She couldn't ignore the attraction she felt for him, an uncontrollable feeling that was growing stronger by the second. She knew she shouldn't be so close to him, but she couldn't push him away. The truth was that with every step Jake took, the narrator felt her resistance fading. There was something mysterious in his presence, something she couldn't ignore. She was on the verge of a decision that could change everything. Deep down, she knew she was at a point of no return, but for a moment, all she could do was take a deep breath and wait for what was to come. And as Jake's footsteps drew closer, the tension inside her only increased. She was about to cross an invisible line, and the fear of the consequence was as great as the desire that consumed her. The next morning, the house seemed to function as if nothing had happened, but the narrator knew everything was different. Jake, with his laid-back demeanor, acted as if what had happened hadn't changed anything. His gestures were casual, almost as if he was testing the boundaries, but in a subtle way that couldn't be ignored. He looked at her with a lightness that made her feel uncomfortable, and at the same time, his gaze carried a deep meaning that she feared to fully understand. Richard, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. He was immersed in his own thoughts, perhaps distracted with work or something else, but he didn't seem to notice the electric energy moving between her and Jake. The narrator was completely divided. On one side, there was the guilt that consumed her, the certainty that she was doing something wrong. She loved Richard, or at least loved the life they had built together, but the desire for Jake was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. It was as if part of her wanted to turn back, do things right, while another part longed to give in to what her body and mind were craving. Every glance exchanged with Jake made this internal struggle more intense. She didn't know what to do with these conflicting feelings, and with each passing moment, the line between what was right and what she felt was becoming even more blurred. The problem was that there was no more room for uncertainty. What once could have been considered a fantasy was now becoming an almost uncontrollable reality. Every second spent with Jake made her more distant from the person she thought she was. What had happened between them was no longer something to be ignored. It was a real temptation, and the protagonist knew that sooner or later, she would have to face the truth. With Richard oblivious to the situation and Jake growing ever closer, she felt lost between what she should do and what she wanted to do. The internal battle was becoming unbearable, and she knew it wouldn't be easy to find a way out. Dinner was happening like any other, or at least that's what the narrator tried to make it seem. Richard was focused on his conversations, distracted by work demands, while Jake, sitting beside her, seemed more present than ever. The narrator, however, was far from being engaged in the conversation. Every word exchanged between them sounded like distant noise. Her attention was entirely focused on Jake, on every movement of his, on every glance that seemed more loaded with meaning than she could bear. The tension grew with every shared laugh, with every casual comment. She felt the weight of the internal conflict intensifying, as if the very environment had become a battlefield. What once seemed like a simple dinner now became an opportunity for raw emotions to manifest. The attraction, which had once only been in her thoughts, now seemed to fill the space around her. She tried to focus on Richard, to give attention to her husband, but she couldn't. Jake's presence was becoming undeniable, and she felt her body reacting uncontrollably to him. The feeling of doing something wrong, of being on a dangerous path, was clear, but the desire was stronger. In a moment of impulse, she decided she needed to step outside, to breathe, and so she moved to the garden, seeking some fresh air to clear her mind. The moment she was alone, feeling the wind brush against her face, Jake appeared beside her. He didn't say anything at first, but the silence between them carried weight. The tension between them was palpable. He moved closer, and without words, his gaze made her realize that he knew exactly what she was feeling. There was no longer any way to hide what was happening, what was forming between them. The feeling of being caught in something forbidden intensified, and the narrator, even though she tried to stay strong, knew she was on the verge of making an irreversible decision. Jake confronted her with his gaze, and in that moment, she felt that there was no turning back. When Richard left for his business trip, the house seemed to become an empty stage where the protagonist could finally face her truth. The silence, which once reflected the emotional distance between her and her husband, now became a sort of liberation, allowing her to pay attention to what she had tried to hide. Every thought, every desire repressed for so long, seemed to intensify with Richard's absence. Jake's presence, once a distant shadow, now seemed to occupy every corner of the house. She knew something would happen, that this was the moment when she could no longer escape, what she felt. The decision, though laden with guilt, seemed inevitable. She could no longer ignore the attraction that consumed her. When Jake appeared in her room, what should have been a simple meeting between two people turned into something much more intense. She felt her body respond to him without resistance, as if all barriers fell at once. Confusion, doubt, guilt. All of it was set aside in that moment. Desire took over her mind and body, and she surrendered, even knowing it was wrong. It wasn't just a kiss or a touch, but a complete surrender to what she felt, to what they shared, even if it was forbidden. After the encounter, guilt flooded the narrator with the same intensity as desire. She knew she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. What had happened between her and Jake could no longer be erased, and the tension between what she wanted and what she knew was right deepened. Deep down, she knew her life was about to change in an irreversible way. Every thought, every shiver, every memory of what had happened consumed her, and guilt surrounded her like a prison. The desire had been satisfying, but the weight of the consequences was overwhelming. She no longer knew who she was or what she should do. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. When Richard returned from his trip, the house seemed different, as if an invisible weight had been placed over everything. The sound of the key in the lock was the trigger for the avalanche of emotions that hit the protagonist. She already knew what she had done, and now, with Richard back, the reality of her choices was even more painful. He walked in, as always, and greeted her, unaware of the internal storm that consumed her. But something had changed in her gaze, something she knew she couldn't hide for much longer. Guilt surrounded her so intensely that it was impossible to disguise the truth. Richard, unaware of the tension hanging in the air, seemed only curious about what had happened during his absence. But for the protagonist, everything was as clear as day. She knew that her body carried the marks of the forbidden encounter, and the idea of looking at Richard without revealing what had happened made her want to disappear. It was as if the weight of the betrayal had permanently marked her. Every gesture, every word, seemed impossible to swallow without feeling the overwhelming weight of what she had done. Richard's gaze, though unsettling, had no idea of the emotional battle she was facing. Finally, Richard left the house, without a word about what he might have noticed. He simply left, and as she watched him walk out silently, the narrator was overcome with a wave of regret. The silence that remained was deafening. She knew that the consequences of that act of betrayal would be inevitable, but at that moment, she felt immersed in an emptiness. Guilt consumed her, and she understood that nothing would ever be the same. What seemed like a momentary escape was now becoming an emotional prison. She had crossed a line that could not be undone, and the weight of the betrayal was there with her, all the time. Now that you've encountered this shocking story, it's time to reflect on your own choices and the impact they have on your life. Betrayal and infidelity can destroy relationships, but they also offer an opportunity for transformation and growth. Are you ready to change your life and learn how to deal with the emotional ups and downs that arise in times of crisis? If you identified with the situation and want to learn how to make wiser decisions, don't forget to apply what you've learned here. Ask yourself, am I truly living according to my values? Life is full of choices, and with the right tools, you can emerge stronger from any situation. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do so now and activate notifications. Don't miss out on the tips and stories that could be the turning point in your journey. Let's continue this conversation and change the course of your story together.